Nicole once believed she understood the human heart very well. She believed she was experienced enough to see who was sincere and who was only drawn in by the glow surrounding her. And she believed even more strongly that in every relationship, the one who could control the other person's breathing rhythm would be the one who won. But perhaps because she had lived too long inside the feeling of being pursued, desired, and placed at the center of every choice, Nicole gradually lost the ability to tell the difference between a genuine need to be loved and an addiction to power, fed by the eyes of men who were always turned toward her. That was why, standing between Carlton and Kial, she did not rush toward a final harbor, nor did she decisively cut away one tangled branch to preserve something clear for the future. She kept them both there, as if their presence could steal the quiet emptiness inside her, as if as long as those two men had not walked away, she could still believe that she had not lost her worth, had not passed the brightest season of her life, had not been left behind by time itself. At first glance, Nicole looked like a woman hesitating before love, a woman torn between two kinds of men, two forms of protection, two possible futures. But the deeper one looked, the more it became clear that behind that hesitation was not only emotion, but also a cold and subtle form of control. She never fully promised herself to Carlton, but she never truly closed the door on him either. She never truly chose Kial, but she always left him with the feeling that with just a little more patience, a little more loyalty, one more moment of standing by her side when she needed him, he would become the last man standing. Nicole did not create a simple love triangle. She created a fragile balance in which both men were suspended in hope, while she stood in the middle, afraid of losing either one and unwilling to give up the feeling of being desired by both. What made that game dangerous was not that Nicole had been deliberately cruel from the beginning, but that she had become too far accustomed to justifying herself. She called it listening to her heart. She called it the right to heal after her old wounds. She called it the caution of a woman who refused to place her life in the wrong hands one more time. But beneath all those layers of language was a truth much harder to accept. Nicole was not only afraid of choosing the wrong man, she was also afraid of the feeling that she might no longer be powerful enough to make others wait for her. She was not only searching for love, she was trying desperately to preserve the sensation that she was still the prize others had to compete for. Carlton was the first to realize it, but he realized it too late, after he had already sunk too deeply into the belief that his steadiness would eventually be rewarded. He once believed Nicole needed time, needed someone mature enough to not pressure her, needed a shoulder that knew when to step back. He accepted exhaustion, accepted the feeling of being placed behind other storms in her life, accepted even being the fact that his name was always spoken as an option rather than a decision. But every form of endurance has its limit. Every time Nicole came to him when she was unstable, every time she leaned on his gentleness to survive a crisis and then drifted away once things calmed down, every time she unconsciously used him as a temporary refuge while refusing to name the relationship with the clarity he deserved, slowly wore down his patience. What hurt him most was not Kial's presence. What hurt more was beginning to understand that even if Kial vanished, Nicole still might not choose him, because the problem had never truly been between two men. The problem was Nicole herself in her hunger to keep every door open at once. Kial, on the other hand, was the kind of man who reacted more fiercely when his pride was touched. He was not as gentle as Carlton, not the kind of person willing to remain in a waiting zone for too long without demanding a definition. He pursued Nicole with the heat of possession, with the belief that if he were strong enough, decisive enough, visible enough, he could force a wavering heart to tilt toward him. But because of that very instinct, he felt even more humiliated when he realized that he had been drawn into a competition whose finish line had never truly existed. He confronted Carlton and had quietly regarded the other man as his greatest obstacle. He believed that if he could defeat his rival, he would win Nicole's heart as well. But the truth revealed itself as something far more merciless. Both he and Carlton were simply two forces that helped Nicole feel that she still had power, still inspired desire, still held the upper hand over other people's emotions. Once he understood that, Kial no longer felt as much anger toward Carlton as he once had. His rage changed direction. It turned straight toward Nicole, then swung back toward himself, because he understood that he allowed his own pride to become a rope around his neck, dragging him deeper into a game he should have walked away from a long time ago. The turning point did not arrive through a public explosion, but through a cold awakening on both sides. Carlton and Kial, after too many repetitions of the same painful pattern, finally reached the same conclusion. They were no longer fighting for love. They were fighting to protect the self-respect they had been eroding day by day. A man can accept losing to a rival, but it is much harder to accept the realization that he was never placed in a fair race to begin with. The pain of defeat is already sharp enough, but the pain of realizing that all one's hope had only been fuel for someone else's ego was far more humiliating. It was precisely that humiliation that erased the hatred between Carlton and Kial. Instead of seeing each other as enemies, they began to understand that they were both victims of the same long, exhausting ambiguity. And then the hardest blow against Nicole came not through a loud argument, but through the moment both men stopped at once. No one held her gaze longer than necessary anymore. No one rushed after her when she turned away coldly. There were no patient gestures waiting for her to change her mind. No more unspoken assurances that no matter how uncertain she remained, they would still be there. For the first time, Nicole was left alone inside the maze she had built herself. That sudden silence made her panic more than any accusation ever could, because it stripped away the one thing she had relied on for so long. The feeling that she would always have the right to choose who stayed. When Carlton and Kial turned away at the same time, she was no longer the one holding the scales. She became the one being judged by the consequences of her own ambiguity.
And then the hardest blow against Nicole came not through a loud argument, but through the moment both men stopped at once. No one held her gaze longer than necessary anymore. No one rushed after her when she turned away coldly. There were no more patient gestures waiting for her to change her mind. No more unspoken assurances that no matter how uncertain she remained, they would still be there. For the first time, Nicole was left alone inside the maze she herself had built. That sudden silence made her panic more than any accusation ever could, because it stripped away the one thing she had relied on for so long. The feeling that she would always have the right to choose who stayed. When Carlton and Kial turned away at the same time, she was no longer the one holding the scales. She became the one being judged by the consequences of her own ambiguity. Nicole reacted with every ugly layer of emotion she had always kept carefully hidden. First came denial. She told herself they were only upset, only trying to pressure her into a decision, only using silence as a tactic. But as day after day passed and neither of them returned, that confidence began to shatter. Then came anger. She was angry at Carlton for leaving after everything he had once promised through the steady intensity of his eyes. She was angry at Kial for being arrogant enough to walk away rather than keep fighting. But deeper than all of that, she was angry with herself. Angry that she had let everything go so far that it could no longer be repaired with a softened smile or a gentler glance at the right moment. Angry because, for the first time, she had to taste helplessness in a game whose rules she had written herself. That anger did not make her stronger. It made her disoriented, unraveling, and it began to expose the cracks she had long covered with pride. When the first layer of defense collapsed, loneliness finally arrived in full force. Nicole was compelled to face the question she had always avoided. Was she grieving Carlton and Kial, or grieving the fact that no one was chasing her anymore? It was the cruelest question of all, because if the answer leaned toward the second, then everything she had called love all this time might have been nothing more than a fear of abandonment dressed in romantic clothing. She had always told herself she simply was not ready. But the more frightening truth was that perhaps she had never wanted to be ready for anyone, because once she chose one person, she would have to give up the power that came from the others. She would have to gamble for real, risk being wounded for real, accept that loving someone meant she could not keep them by her side through half measures. It was at that moment that another blow landed, one even more painful. Ted moved on calmly and clearly, even beginning to build a new happiness with Janice. That image struck Nicole in a way Carlton and Kial's departure had not. Carlton and Kial only made her lose the right to choose. Ted forced her to confront the truth that life was continuing without needing her at the center of it. Ted had once been a major part of her emotional journey, a man tied to both injury and pride, to everything unfinished that she had never truly put away. She might no longer have wanted to return to him in the old sense, but seeing him content beside Shanice awakened in her a silent and bitter sense of failure. It was not exactly the residue of love. It felt more like a violent collision with her own pride. Nicole could not bear the thought that the man, who had once belonged to her emotional orbit, had now stepped completely at peaceful somewhere else, no longer turning back to seek any recognition from her. The combination of those two losses pushed Nicole into a state of instability she had never known before. Carlton and Kial leaving meant she lost the emotional support of the present. Ted moving on meant she also lost the illusion of the past. Every path she had once used to maintain her sense of control closed one by one. In that moment, Nicole was no longer the seductive, sharp woman who knew how to shift circumstances with her charm. She became someone stripped bare before her own inner deficiencies, someone forced to look directly at the truth that for all this time, she had not truly built a real love with anyone. She had only built circles for other people to revolve around her, while she stood still at the center and called that being loved. Yet this crisis could also become the most important turning point of her life, because only after losing every mirror that once reflected her importance back to her does a person begin to understand what remains to hold on to. Nicole now stood before two possible roads. One was to continue down the old path, turning pain into bitterness, loneliness into rage, and then finding new targets to manipulate in order to prove that she still had the power to make others throw themselves into conflict over her. If she chose that road, she might preserve the appearance of strength for a while longer, but the cost would be a growing emptiness. And every relationship that followed would eventually collapse once others recognized the same old pattern. The other path was far harder, to admit that she had been wrong, that she had used ambiguity to postpone her fear of rejection, that she had allowed a power-hungry ego to overpower her ability to love sincerely. That was the only road that could lead Nicole toward real change, but it was also the road that would force her through shame, humiliation, and a direct confrontation with the weakest parts of herself. Perhaps the most haunting part of this entire tragedy was not that Nicole lost 3 men in 3 different ways, but that for the first time she understood that being pursued is not the same thing as being loved. People can chase you because of your allure, because of the challenge, because of the illusion of victory, because there is some unreachable part of you they want to conquer. But real love demands something entirely different: clarity, courage, choice, and the willingness to close every backup door in order to step fully toward one person. Nicole had avoided all of that for far too long, so when the game ended, what remained was not only loneliness, but also the vast emptiness of a woman who had lived beneath too many eyes without ever giving her heart a place where it could truly belong. And that is what makes this story so bitter. Nicole did not collapse simply because she was abandoned. She collapsed because she realized she had helped create that ending herself. Carlton and Kial's departure was not only an act of retaliation for her prolonged indecision, but also a mirror reflecting a truth she never wanted to face. Ted's happiness with Shanice was not just a side development, but a cold confirmation that the world does not stop and wait for someone who refuses to decide forever. If Nicole does not change, she will continue losing everything in the same way, only with different names and different settings. But if she is brave enough to look at today's ruins as a necessary verdict, then this may be the first time she learns that love is not about keeping many people close to fight off loneliness, but about daring to step into the truth with a heart that no longer needs power in order to feel valuable. At the very bottom of her panic, with her pride crushed and the terrifying silence left behind after everyone turned away, Nicole is left with only one question she can no longer escape. Does she truly want to be loved, or does she only want to remain forever as the person others need? The answer to that question will decide whether she can save what remains of the human part of herself, or whether she will continue sliding down the same old road until everything is gone. And sometimes, the most tragic thing is not being left behind, but realizing that you were the one who pushed away every person who once wanted to stay. Thank you for taking the time to watch my video, and thank you for your trust. All the content I create is purely speculative and based on personal experience. If you find the video interesting and helpful, please support me with a like and a comment.